New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is pleased to present The Inclusive Church, Ideas and Resources for Leaders of Multicultural Ministries. The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Tuesdays at 12 noon Mountain Time. Join Tracy and her guests as they go deep and share practical tips and resources you can use in your ministry. And now let's explore the Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown.
Hey everybody, it is Tracy Brown here with the Inclusive Church right here on the New Thought Media Network. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I love hanging out with you every week and talking about what does it take to be inclusive. How do you create an inclusive New Thought spiritual community? What are some of the pitfalls that we might want to either avoid or get the skill to crawl out of? But most of the time, what are the things that we are doing that are fun or that get positive results? What works? So sometimes when people are talking about being inclusive, they are so focused on all the problems, how difficult it is, how uncomfortable it makes people. But we get to talk most of the time about what we can do to make it work. How do we prepare people to be able to be excited about the opportunity to be inclusive? And then, of course, we spend a lot of time on what are the questions you need to consider or the skills you need to develop. I always, at the top of every show, take 60 seconds to remind myself and everyone else that when I say inclusive church, I am reclaiming the meaning of church to be any community or gathering of people. The church is not the building that we are in. The church is the community we're building and the people who are engaged in learning and practicing spiritual principle together. And inclusive church also, we use the word leaders a lot. Here's what leaders can do, or leaders should keep in mind these three things. And by now, if you're a regular listener, you can probably say it for me. You don't have to be a minister to be a leader. In fact, ministers could not lead or could not have successful communities without all kinds of other people who are leading individual volunteer teams or serving on the board of directors or helping with marketing and communications, or those folks who are writing checks or sending money to sustain the church or the community. So leaders means anyone who's involved in a way that impacts and influences others. Having said that, what are we going to talk about today? Today is a toolkit day, so that does mean that the goal is to spend about 30 minutes and 35 minutes and really focus in on what's some information that's helpful, what are some tips to keep in mind, and then releasing you back into the rest of your day. The focus and the topic for today is affinity groups, what they are, how to use them, what are some of the challenges that come up, some of the common challenges that come up both within affinity groups and with people who are not a part of the affinity groups. But mostly just what are affinity groups and why would you want to consider them if you are creating, maintaining, or expanding an inclusive spiritual community? Number one, what are they? So if you just look at the word affinity, meaning things that are alike or similar, or in this case, people who share something in common and have an affinity toward one another. Affinity groups in our spiritual communities are those groups that bring people together not only in terms of the spiritual teaching or the foundational principles that you are teaching all the time, but allows people with some similar background or some similar interest to also gather together. And so probably the most common affinity groups that we find in our spiritual communities is, a women's circle or women's auxiliary or a women's networking group. Women's groups exist and have for a long time, maybe as long as any of us can remember, even outside of New Thought. I remember growing up in the church my family attended, a Baptist church, and there was a women's auxiliary that, of course, it gave women in the church an opportunity to get to know each other better, to bond, and to also provide service. So they did lots of service projects that they would plan and then they would execute that supported the ministry of the church. They also did a fair amount of teaching and education, and they planned that like events or series that the women's auxiliary would host. And so what I've seen in many New Thought communities is a women's circle. And again, it's not in competition with anyone or anything. It is, wow, everybody is learning the same principles and using the same spiritual practices, and women get to come together and talk about maybe sometimes how it's how they are applying it. And that may be different than the way men apply the principles in their lives, or what kinds of issues and challenges they are facing as women, and getting support and advice from other women in the context of using our spiritual principles and our spiritual foundation as a guide for how we show up in the world. So affinity groups could be a women's group, it could be a men's circle. Some communities have an African American or Black circle or affinity group. There are some communities that I've been exposed to where the community itself is predominantly African American, and they may have an affinity group for people who are specifically interested in social justice, for example, or some specific theme or topic. There is a CFL community that has an affinity group that I don't remember exactly what it's called. They have a really cute name for it, and I'm not remembering it because right now all I can think about is it's really like a book club, but it's people who are in that community who love to read, and they don't have a lot of opportunity to talk about the books that they're reading. So this particular CSL center they have a monthly book that is chosen, and it is related to either science of mind or metaphysics or new thought. And people read the books and then come together and talk about them, get their questions answered. I'm familiar with a similar group at a Unity church that I've interacted with quite a bit. And they don't choose a different book each month, but they choose a book and they go through it together. And then when they are done with that book, right, they choose the next book. So sometimes it might only be 5 weeks. And then another for a different book, it might be 10 weeks, depending on how many chapters the book is, etc. And so they have an affinity group for people who love to read. And it also doubles as an educational offering. But the primary focus initially was people love to read and they didn't have anybody to talk to about the books they were reading. You can also have affinity groups based on any ethnicity or ethnic group or cultural group. So you might have an affinity group that focuses on Spanish speakers or on young adults between, some specific ages. And I've seen all of those. I've also seen an affinity groups and talked with folks who've been involved in an affinity group, not around Spanish language, but around American Sign Language, and wanting to learn and support each other in learning American Sign Language and learning to understand how to serve the deaf community and the deaf or hard of hearing community. I am not aware of, although I think it would be great if there were enough people in a community to actually have an affinity group for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but I'm not aware of that happening. If in your community you actually are serving enough people, excuse me, who are having that experience, that would be another way for them to network and bond and talk about and practice using the spiritual principles and practices in their lives. So that's what affinity groups are. And the question of why would you have them, in my mind, is so simple. The answer is so simple. You have them because you want to create opportunities for people to find those with whom they share some characteristics. Now, let's say that in your community, you have 30 or 40% of your community are people of color, and the majority of them are African American or Black. Everybody in that group is not the same. So just by having an affinity group of people who identify as Black, that doesn't mean they're all going to agree or they're all going to have the exact same experience or the same needs. All it means is that they're going to have some shared cultural experience and they're going to get to know each other better. They're going to build a network, and that's going to keep them engaged in your community. And it's a both and. In every group that I have seen, where there will be people who will participate in the affinity groups, and that helps them feel like the larger community is home for them. It's a both and, it's not an either or. Why else would you have an affinity group? You might have or create or support affinity groups to help grow a population. So, for example, with Spanish speakers, if you live in an urban area or in an area where you are trying to grow the population that participates in your community's activities, and you have access to reach many people for whom Spanish is a first or second language, then you might create an affinity group for a couple of reasons. One, it is creating a welcome bridge into the larger community. And two, you will be able to get input and feedback and ideas and resources from the participants in this group of what would make your overall community a more welcoming, a more safe, a more respectful place for people who speak Spanish. So one of the reasons I tell leaders in spiritual communities to consider creating or growing affinity groups is because you don't know what you don't know. If I'm not a member of that demographic, I don't know what may be needed, required, or desired. But if I have a group of people and they are getting to know each other and they are finding ways to teach or incorporate our spiritual teachings, they're also going to be able to educate me as a leader about what can be done. So let's talk a little bit about some of the surprises or some of the successes that are the result of having affinity groups. Now, I could probably bore you with 2 or 2.5 hours of examples because I get excited about, when people are sharing with me about things that they have done or what worked, and sometimes what didn't work, because we can learn from that too. But I get so excited when people have shared examples with me. I kind of catalog them in my head, but I'm going to try to pick just a few, and I'm going to look over here at the clock. Okay, I'm going to give myself 5 minutes to share some examples. So you won't get the whole list, but I want to give you a variety of ideas about good things that have come from having affinity groups. I'll start with my own home spiritual community, CSL Dallas. And about 5 years ago, we've had an African American circle for much longer than that. But about 5 years ago, the African American circle took on a project of identifying who were some of the Black movers and shakers, or people who were Black who influenced the teaching or the spreading of science of mind in previous decades, like between 1930 and 2000. And so at first it was just a conversation because there were people in our group who just were curious and wanted to know, like, who were some of the Black pioneers in religious science and science of mind. And as a result of having those discussions and doing some research, the African American Circle took on initiated a project of creating 4 videos. And the idea was, let's create short videos, 5 minutes or less, 4 minutes or less, that could actually be shared during the course of a Sunday service, or could be shared in a class that was a history class as added information. And the result was 4 videos that featured, as I recall, about 11 or 12 different influencers of how science of mind was expanded or was taught or was shared by people who were Black. That was a benefit not only for the African American Circle, but also for the entire CSL Dallas community. And then it went beyond that. and was shared throughout Centers for Spiritual Living. And there are many, many centers that have shown those videos on Sundays or in classes to give people exposure to contributions made by Black people in the past. So win, win, win. And that probably would not have happened if that circle, if the African American circle had not pulled together a lot of resources, right? Different people to narrate, different people to video, different people to edit, different people to take photos and make them work, different people to do the research. And as leaders in our community, you know, it was leaders of the circle, leaders in terms of the overall ministry saying, yes, this benefits us. A couple other examples. I mentioned people gathering together to learn American Sign Language. And this is a circle that was not in just one community, but it was across the nation, people coming together and saying, we want to learn this, we want to support each other, and we want to learn not only basics in sign language that we can use in our Sunday services and events, but also understand the culture so that when people who are deaf come to our community, we are greeting them appropriately and that we are asking the right questions and that we're really accessible in a meaningful way. And so that affinity group, even though it wasn't just with one center, spent a year together really building a foundation that became a model for there to be some groups like that at a few individual centers. And many of the original group continued on to continue to learn more skill and understand the culture better. Let's see, another example. I only have 2 minutes remaining. Let's see. Another example that I really, really love is that there was a community that had a number of people in their community of Indian descent. And there were some conversations about, you know, what holidays do we recognize? And so having an Indian affinity group allowed that particular church to learn more about Diwali, for example, and the Festival of Lights, and be able to understand it and then recognize how it really relates to other things that were already being celebrated. So it's easy to integrate it into the conversation, into the events plan for the year, because in New Thought, right, in all areas, all denominations of New Thought, we believe that all paths lead to the one God. There's only one God, one creator, one source of life. And understanding how that plays out in different cultures, that you're celebrating the harvest, or you're celebrating the coming of light, or you're celebrating the change and the transition of the seasons. So Diwali would probably not have been integrated into that community's annual celebration or events calendar, except that the affinity group was like, here's what we teach, here's how it overlaps with Diwali, and here's how they're integrated, and let's educate our community members about this. It also became outreach for that particular church to grow its membership, because they were able to attract people to their event who were like, I didn't know you all were even here. And I understand I can be spiritual and I can also keep my cultural traditions alive. So for me, that was one of the ones too, that it's one of the benefits of encouraging people who are similar in some way to come together. So maybe you have some examples that come to mind for you. And if you do, feel free to drop them into the chat or make a comment, and I can pull that forward. Because, as I said, I could go for 2 hours giving you other examples. And I will close with this example. It's a two-part example. Again, back to Spanish-speaking members and guests and the Spanish-speaking community. I was really happy this past Halloween season because I saw more than ever before a focus on or an inclusion of Dias de los Muertos and the Day of the Dead, and how the spiritual aspect of that, like the veil is thin, and the connection between those who are living and those who have died, and honoring that, not being afraid of it, and honoring the eternal and everlasting life. I just loved how many different communities I saw compared to 10 years ago, where it was really rare to see that in New Thought communities. But it's inclusive, not because you're making fun of or not because you're culturally appropriating, but because you can easily connect the spiritual principles that you are teaching all year long to the way that this particular culture takes that up. That's when it becomes a win-win for everyone. And affinity circles often are the places where those kinds of things get birthed, because the people who are in those groups are already navigating multiple identities. The identity of being a part of your general overall community, and their identities by age or language or culture or ethnicity. And so they're the places, they're the people who can help you build bridges across cultures and be inclusive. Okay, so I promised you, since this is a toolkit week, that I would stay 30 to 35 minutes. So let me just give you a little warning. Those are some of the success stories, but I don't want you to go all in without being aware that you will have some naysayers or some people who are uncomfortable with affinity groups. You will have people who will say, well, when are we going to have a group for white people? Because instead of just the Black people and the brown people. And you can have your response to that and take that question seriously, right? So you can have responses that are grounded in, well, our basic primary way of being in our community, because we're predominantly white, is a representation. Like our whole, the way we do things is an affinity group for people who are white. And you also are able, if you're interested in learning more about any of these cultures, you could participate in them. You can have a response that is engaging them in more dialogue about what is their discomfort. Tell me more about that. And use that as a way to reinforce your community's commitment to being inclusive. And it gives you an opportunity to have a conversation about why you value diversity and how the diversity is reflecting all the ways that God shows up in human form. And so it is not out of alignment. Another pushback that a number of leaders have received around affinity groups is really just the selection of which ones. And so what most of the communities I'm familiar with have done is they really don't try to go out and start a group, but they tell people if you have an interest and there are, 10 or 12 other people who have that same interest, then here's some guidelines in terms of what the structure is and what the expectations are in terms of spiritual practice and integrating the spiritual teachings into the agenda and into the events planned, et cetera, et cetera. And so you want to have that kind of structure. But unless I can think of a few situations where you might want to initiate a group rather than people coming to leadership and saying we would like to form a group. And I can think of a few reasons, especially if you have a strategic plan to increase your membership by 10% with a certain demographic, then you might want to start a group with that in mind. But if you already have a community, I would start with encouraging people who share some similarity to form a group around a common interest or a common way of being. And the final concern that frequently comes up is people fearing or being uncomfortable thinking they are missing out, that the people in the affinity groups are getting special treatment or special information. And the easiest fix for that is simply to, number one, have some structure and share that. And so that you can assure people, or they can see what kinds of things are happening. Another response is to, again, encourage them to be curious enough to either join a group that they would like to know more about or become more comfortable with, or to create a group for themselves based on a common interest that does fit under the umbrella of your overall community. So affinity groups do not usually happen without some little hiccup or some discomfort. But if you are committed to creating an inclusive community, virtual or in person, then you might really want to take seriously the option of creating affinity groups and start small. Don't try to jump in and have 10 affinity groups right away, all at the same time. Start with one or two. Start with the ones that make sense for your community. And as I said at the top, for many communities in our New Thought world, that would be a men's group and a women's group, or a young adults group, and and then another group, so that you are beginning to give depth to people who want it, and you are modeling what it means to be inclusive. So those are my tips, and that's the information, the high level information about creating and maintaining or expanding affinity groups. I think they are an excellent way to expand your brand and to demonstrate your commitment to being inclusive. And I hope that this is helpful for you as we go into the holiday season and are doing our planning for 2025. Think about how you might be able to have affinity groups in your community next year. My name is Tracy Brown. I am here with you every Tuesday at noon Mountain Time, right here on the New Thought Media Network. Thanks for joining in today.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.
New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring. On behalf of everyone at New Thought Media Network, thank you for being a member of our virtual family. Your financial contributions help share the New Thought message with people from around the world. Please visit and contribute at www.ntmedia.org/donate. New Thought Media Network. Come be you. And please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, peace and blessings.